James knew that being a black lawyer was a challenge, but he never thought that his dedication to the truth would turn into a catastrophe because of his skin color. When the system decided that a black man couldn't win, everyone he considered allies turned away from him, and the charges he had saved his client from suddenly fell on him. What drove James to take desperate measures that shocked everyone? But let's start from the beginning. James Williams stood in front of the tall mirror in his small apartment, adjusting his tie as if it could give him additional confidence. Today was his first day at a new job, a prestigious law firm in the city center, where he had been striving to secure a position for several years. But along with pride, anxiety settled in his heart. He knew that he wasn't being welcomed with open arms, despite his qualifications and merits. As he approached the firm's building, he felt the sideways glances. Entering the lavishly decorated lobby, James noticed curious and hostile looks from the employees. Some nodded politely, while others openly turned away, pretending not to see him. It was unpleasant, but not unexpected. He knew that to many of his colleagues, he was only there because of a quota, a black lawyer who got into the firm thanks to corporate rules, not his abilities. "Hey, James," came a voice from behind him, causing him to turn around. In front of him stood Steve, one of the senior partners, smiling with such strained sincerity that it seemed his face might crack. "Hi, Steve," James replied, trying not to show his discomfort. "I hope you're ready for some serious work. We don't go easy on newcomers here," Steve continued, patting him on the shoulder. Steve's words didn't sound like a greeting, but rather a warning, and James felt a chill down his spine. When he reached his new office, there was already a case file on the desk, his first assignment. James sat down and opened the folder. It was a defense case for a black man accused of a serious crime, which he seemingly did not commit. As he delved into the materials, James realized that his client was facing unjust charges because of his race. Taking a deep breath, he understood that his task now was not just to win the case, but to show that justice can be achieved despite the system's bias. The next day, James immersed himself in the work on the case. He knew that every step he took would be under a microscope, every success or failure scrutinized. As he reviewed the case materials, he began to notice numerous inconsistencies. The witness statements were confusing, the evidence weak. Everything pointed to the fact that his client had been accused due to bias and racism. "Do you really think you can change anything?" Melissa, one of his colleagues, unexpectedly interrupted his thoughts. She stood at his office door, her expression doubtful. "Why do you think so?" James asked, trying not to show his confusion. "Because the system here doesn't work for people like you or your client," she replied coldly. "You can be as smart as you want, but it won't change anything." Melissa's words cut deep into James, but instead of despairing, he felt a fire ignite within him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that bias and racism were deeply rooted in the system, but he wasn't going to give up. Every day, working on the case, James encountered new obstacles. His colleagues refused to help, documents disappeared, and key witnesses suddenly changed their testimony. Interaction with the court also offered no relief. There he was met with open distrust. James felt the atmosphere around him thickening, as if the system itself was resisting his attempts to seek the truth. The day of the trial arrived. James felt the tension in the air, like before a storm. He was ready for anything, but the reality turned out to be even harsher than he had anticipated. As he began to present his arguments, the judge barely concealed his disdain. Every point James made was met with cold skepticism, every piece of evidence with disbelief. At one point, when James presented key evidence that could exonerate his client, the judge didn't even allow him to elaborate, cutting him off mid-sentence. "This is irrelevant," the judge declared in an icy tone, dismissing the papers James had painstakingly gathered. James felt everything inside him tighten with anger and helplessness. He knew he was facing more than just bias. This was blatant racism aimed at breaking his will. When the session ended, James left the courtroom feeling empty. He realized that his fight was much more difficult than he had imagined. This was not just a legal case. It was a battle for justice in a world where he himself was not considered equal. But instead of giving up, James felt a new resolve growing inside him. He understood that he couldn't stop, that his struggle went beyond a single case. It had become his personal challenge, to prove that the system can be changed and that he would not yield an inch, despite all the difficulties and dangers that lay ahead. James felt a chill run down his spine as he entered his office on Monday morning. As soon as he stepped through the door, he noticed that the atmosphere in the firm had changed. It seemed as if the walls were closing in around him, and even the air felt heavy. Colleagues who had previously acknowledged him with a nod now avoided his gaze. Some even openly turned away when he approached. On his desk, James found documents that were supposed to help him prepare for the upcoming trial. But as he flipped through them, he noticed that many important pages were missing. This couldn't have been an accident. Trying to find out who was responsible, he approached his supervisor, but he was only met with a dismissive response. "James, you need to be more careful," said the supervisor with a slight smirk. "Maybe you just forgot where you left the papers?" These words were laced with venom, and James realized that a game had started against him within the firm. He understood that the sabotage was intentional, not just aimed at undermining his work, but also at breaking him down mentally. An internal conflict began to grow within him. Was it worth continuing to fight in a place where everyone was against him? But, remembering that his client's life was at stake, he clenched his fists with determination. James knew he couldn't trust anyone in his firm. Desperate to find allies among his colleagues, he made the decision to work alone. However, this turned out to be more challenging than he had anticipated. Access to the necessary resources was limited, and each day brought new difficulties. Documents disappeared, witnesses retracted their statements. It seemed as though the whole world had united against him. One evening, as he stayed late at work, Melissa, the same colleague who had previously doubted his abilities, knocked on his office door. She entered without waiting for an invitation and sat down across from him. "James, I know things aren't easy for you right now," she began, "but you have to understand that you're fighting against a system that doesn't want you to win." James looked at her. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only cold understanding. "And what do you suggest, Melissa? To give up? To let them break me?" he asked, holding back his anger. She paused for a moment, then quietly said, "Sometimes it's better to walk away with your head held high than to die on this battlefield." But James wasn't about to retreat. He managed to find support among members of the Black community, who helped him gather new evidence and prepare a strong defense. He knew that challenges awaited him ahead, but he was determined not to give up without a fight. After another long day, James left the office and headed to his car in the parking lot. The evening air was cool, and he tried to relax by taking deep breaths, but his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise behind him. Turning around, he saw several unidentified men approaching him quickly. "Hey, lawyer! We warned you!" A harsh voice sounded as one of them stepped forward and sharply pushed him in the shoulder. James felt a surge of adrenaline. He knew this wasn't just a threat, but a real attempt to intimidate him and force him to drop the case. One of the attackers grabbed him by the collar, pinning him against the car. "Drop the case, or you'll regret it," hissed another, clenching his fist. At that moment, a thought flashed through James's mind. Was it worth risking his life for this? But immediately following that came the realization that if he backed down now, he would be betraying not only himself, but also all those who believed in his fight. These people were counting on him, and their hope depended on his resolve. When the attackers left, leaving him in the parking lot with a split lip and a torn suit, James straightened up and took a deep breath. His hands were trembling, but inside he felt a strange calm. He knew he couldn't give up. "You can try to break me, but I won't back down," he whispered, clenching his fists. His determination to continue the fight, despite the threats, only grew stronger. James understood that his life only had meaning when he was fighting for truth and justice, and now he was ready to face any challenges that lay ahead. James woke up with the feeling that something was wrong. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed that more and more people were starting to avoid him. At work, this was particularly evident. Colleagues who once at least maintained formal contact now steered clear of him. Clients he had worked with for years suddenly began canceling meetings or even outright refusing his services. This atmosphere of alienation weighed heavily on James. He knew that his work and fight for justice didn't make him popular among those who preferred the system to remain unchanged. But he didn't expect to encounter such a wall of hostility and fear. Behind these actions were clearly forces that didn't want him to continue his fight. Sitting at his desk, James reflected on what was happening. He realized that the situation was slipping out of his control, but he couldn't afford to retreat. The inner conflict grew. Should he continue, knowing that his reputation might be irrevocably destroyed? Or was it time to stop and reassess his priorities? But every time these thoughts crossed his mind, he remembered the people whose fate depended on his resolve. When there was a knock on the door, James looked up sharply. Standing at the doorway was a senior partner, his face stern and cold. "James, can I have a word with you?" he said, motioning towards his office. Mentally preparing for an unpleasant conversation, James followed him. His intuition didn't fail him. The senior partner began the conversation with reproaches, accusing James of damaging the firm's reputation and strongly advising him to reconsider his priorities. "Do you understand that because of your stubbornness we're losing clients?" the partner said coldly. James clenched his fists, trying to contain his anger. He understood that it wasn't about the clients, but that his fight was threatening those who had become accustomed to the comfort and stability of a corrupt system. "My job is to protect those who can't protect themselves," James replied firmly. "If that threatens someone's profits, then I'm on the right path." The senior partner only sighed heavily and left, leaving James to ponder just how far he was willing to go for his principles. The situation worsened with each passing day. James felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He was denied access to important documents. Clients were withdrawing their cases en masse, and colleagues he had worked with side by side stopped returning his calls. He was alone, but this loneliness only strengthened his resolve. One evening, after a grueling day, James received a call from someone he didn't expect to hear from. It was Marcus, a black lawyer with whom James had crossed paths several years ago during a trial. Marcus was known for his high-profile cases and his fight for the rights of the black community, and his words always carried weight. "James, I've heard you're having problems," Marcus said, and his voice was filled with genuine concern. "I think you should meet with some people. This could change the course of your fight." Feeling like he had nothing to lose, James agreed to the meeting. He understood that he now needed allies who understood what he was facing and could help him in this unequal battle. That evening, they met in a private club where several other black lawyers had gathered. The atmosphere was tense, but at the same time, hopeful. These people had long been fighting against what had only begun to threaten James, and they knew how to act in such situations. "The system is against us, James," Marcus began, addressing those present. "But we must not back down. We can use their own weapons against them." These words inspired James. He realized that he wasn't alone in his struggle, and that together they could achieve much more than they could individually. From that moment on, they began developing a plan of action aimed at exposing the corrupt connections within the judicial system and proving the discrimination faced not only by their clients, but by themselves as well. A few weeks later, James began to see the first signs of success. New evidence emerged confirming the existence of corruption schemes, and his cases began gaining momentum again. He felt that their fight was reaching a new level, that the truth was finally beginning to prevail. However, soon there was a blow that shook him to his core. One evening, while working late in his office, he received a call from the police. The messenger was cold and formal. His old friend and colleague, with whom James had started his career, had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. This man, like James, was a lawyer who fought against injustice and openly spoke out against the system. James felt the world around him collapse. He sat in his chair, unable to believe what he had heard. The thought that his friend might have been killed for his fight wouldn't leave his mind. This news made him think about how high the price was that he was willing to pay for the truth. The next day, when he met with Marcus and the other allies, James couldn't hide his shock. He told them what had happened, and they shared his grief. But in their eyes, there was a determination that pushed James toward the same resolve. "We all understand what we're getting into," Marcus said, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "But this is our mission. We're fighting not just for ourselves, but for all those who can't fight." These words awakened a new determination in James. He realized that he couldn't back down despite all the dangers. His friend had given his life for the truth, and James wasn't going to let his death be in vain. Now this fight had become personal for him, and he was ready to go to the end, knowing that his mission was more than just defending one client. It was a fight for truth and justice for everyone. James sat at his desk, trying to focus on yet another document. The papers before his eyes blurred, and his thoughts kept returning to his recent conversation with Elizabeth. In recent weeks, his work had consumed more and more of his time, and he noticed that his personal life was beginning to fall apart under this pressure. Elizabeth had become increasingly worried about his safety. She often asked questions that James tried to ignore, hoping to reassure her. But with each passing day, her anxiety became more palpable. She asked if he should step back, to stop the case that had attracted so much attention and so many threats. "James, I can't bear to see you exhausting yourself like this," she said one evening when he returned home late again. "This case, it's too dangerous. We could lose everything we have." These words penetrated his consciousness, leaving a mark. He understood that Elizabeth was right in her concerns, but he also knew that he couldn't just give up. For him, this was more than just work. It was a fight for truth, for justice. "I understand that you're worried," he replied, trying to speak softly. "But I can't abandon this case. A man's life is at stake, and I can't betray my principles." Elizabeth sighed heavily, and in her eyes, he saw not only fear, but also a growing sense of alienation. James realized that his fight for justice was beginning to destroy not only his soul, but their relationship as well. With each passing day, the tension between James and Elizabeth grew. She became increasingly withdrawn, and he immersed himself in work, trying to avoid the conversation that was clearly troubling them both. James began to notice that his friends, too, were becoming distant. It seemed that the fear surrounding his case was pushing people away, and he found himself more and more alone with his thoughts. One evening, as he stayed late at work again, his phone rang. It was Elizabeth. "We need to talk, James." Her voice was full of tension. He knew this conversation would be difficult, but he couldn't avoid it. When he returned home, Elizabeth was already waiting for him, sitting on the couch. The room was filled with a suffocating silence. "I can't do this anymore," she began, her voice trembling. "Every time you leave the house, I'm afraid you won't come back. This fight, it's tearing us apart. I understand that it's important to you, but I'm important too, James. Our relationship is important." James didn't know what to say. He looked at her, realizing that his decisions had led to this situation. He loved Elizabeth, but he also knew that he couldn't betray his principles and abandon the case that had become a symbol of his fight for truth. "I don't want to lose you, Elizabeth," he finally said, trying to find the right words. "But I can't back down. I just can't." These words were the final straw. Elizabeth nodded quietly, her eyes filling with tears. "Then maybe I need to leave," she whispered, unable to hold back the tears any longer. James felt his world collapsing around him. He couldn't believe that his fight for justice had cost him the thing he loved most in the world. The next day, James woke up alone in an empty apartment. Elizabeth had left, leaving only a note saying she couldn't continue living in constant fear for his life. He held the note in his hands, feeling the emptiness fill his heart. He had lost the person who meant the most to him, and it was a heavy blow. James sat at his desk, trying to collect his thoughts. He was alone, but his inner struggle continued. He understood that his mission was important, that he couldn't simply abandon the case, but now he began to question the price he was paying. He remembered Elizabeth's words and realized that his fight required not only courage, but wisdom as well. He couldn't allow himself to destroy everything he had for the sake of one goal. James understood that he needed to find a way to balance his professional life and personal happiness. Otherwise, his fight would be meaningless. With this thought, he decided to continue his work, but with a new understanding that he needed to value those who were close to him. He knew that now he had to be not only a strong lawyer, but also a person capable of maintaining the relationships and happiness that made his life complete. James stood by the window of his office, looking at the street below where people went about their business, unaware of the battle unfolding behind the scenes of the judicial system. He knew that the time had come when silence could no longer be his weapon. He needed to draw public attention to the case he was fighting for and show how deeply racism and corruption were rooted in the judicial system. His decision to organize a press conference was not spontaneous. It was a carefully considered step, dictated not only by the need to protect his client, but also by the need to protect himself from the growing persecution. James understood that speaking to the press would make him a target, but he had no other choice. When he told Elizabeth about his decision, she only sighed, showing that she supported him but was afraid for his safety. "You understand that after this, there's no going back?" she asked, looking him in the eyes. "I know," he replied with determination in his voice, though internally he was plagued with doubts. "But if I stay silent, they'll continue to operate in the shadows, and no one will ever know the truth." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that it was impossible to change his mind. She supported him, but the fear for him never left her. The press conference was scheduled for the next day. James prepared for it, choosing his words carefully and rehearsing his speech. He knew that every word would matter, that every action would be scrutinized, not only by his friends, but also by his enemies. On the day of the press conference, James felt like he was about to go into battle. He was tense, but resolute. There was a fire in his eyes that he drew from his sense of justice. Many journalists, activists, and simply concerned people gathered at the event. James stepped onto the stage and took a deep breath, feeling his heart start to beat faster. "Today, I stand before you not just as a lawyer, but as a man who has faced injustice and cannot remain silent," he began his speech. James spoke about how his client had been unfairly accused, how the system, which was supposed to protect the law and justice, had become a tool of oppression. He talked about the racism that had taken root in the judicial system and how his own life had been put in danger because of his fight for the truth. His words were full of emotion, and this left no one indifferent. The room was filled with tense silence, and everyone present could feel the weight of his words sinking into their hearts. After his speech, journalists began asking questions, many of which were sharp and provocative. James responded calmly and confidently, knowing he had to remain strong despite all the threats and pressure. But amidst all this attention, he also felt support. Activists and human rights defenders stood by his side, openly expressing their approval of his actions. This gave James even more resolve to continue his fight. However, not everything was smooth. Soon after the press conference, threats began pouring in. Anonymous calls and letters threatening his life became a regular occurrence. James knew this was a response to his courage, but he wasn't about to stop. Several weeks passed after the press conference, and James continued to work on the case. Public support gave him strength, but he understood that the main battle was still ahead. Everything was going according to plan until something happened that he didn't expect. An important witness, whose testimony could determine the outcome of the case, suddenly disappeared. This news shook James. He understood perfectly well that without this witness, his chances of success sharply diminished. The office was filled with tense silence, and even his colleagues, who were accustomed to unexpected turns, seemed worried. "What are we going to do?" one of his assistants asked, looking at James with concern. James took a deep breath, trying to hide the despair that gripped him. He knew he had two options: continue the fight with what he had, or risk everything by trying to find the missing witness. His thoughts raced, and he realized that the decision he was about to make could cost him everything he had worked for. Elizabeth, watching him, quietly approached and squeezed his hand. "James, you always knew this wouldn't be easy," she said softly. "But I believe in you. You'll find a way." These words were a source of support for him. He realized that he had to continue, despite all the difficulties. The truth was on his side, and he couldn't allow fear and uncertainty to make him back down. The next morning, James made his decision. He would continue the fight, despite the disappearance of the witness. He knew he had to fight to the end, even if it meant taking risks. This battle had become for him not just a case, but a matter of honor and justice. He was ready to go to the end, knowing that truth and justice were worth it. James sat at his desk, holding in his hands a subpoena for a new hearing in his client's case. This was the moment he had been fighting for over the past few months. But instead of feeling satisfied, he was filled with anxiety. Over the past few weeks, the pressure on him had increased to an unbearable level. Constant threats over the phone, unknown people were spotted near his home, and several times he noticed suspicious cars following him around the city. Occasionally, James caught himself thinking that this fear was starting to eat him from the inside. His thoughts returned to Elizabeth, to her warnings and concerns for his safety. She often said that he should be careful, that he shouldn't risk his life for one case. But for James, this case had become more than just a professional challenge. It was the embodiment of his struggle against a system that discriminated and oppressed, and he couldn't afford to back down. When the phone rang, James flinched. He picked up the receiver, expecting yet another anonymous threat, but on the other end was the calm voice of his assistant. "James, I just got a message that security measures at the courthouse have been increased. It seems they know something about the upcoming hearing," the assistant said, and there was a note of concern in his voice. James felt his heart tighten with tension. He understood that the threats he had been receiving were real, and now the court's actions confirmed it. But despite the fear, he knew he couldn't back down. "Thank you, I'll be ready," James replied shortly, hanging up the phone. His decision was made. He would go to the end, despite the threats and dangers. But now he had to find the strength within himself to overcome the fear and not succumb to the pressure. On the day of the hearing, James felt a mix of excitement and determination. He knew that today everything could change. As he entered the courtroom, he was met with looks from the prosecutor and the judge, full of bias and hostility. He felt that every move he made was being analyzed. Every word he spoke would be scrutinized. The prosecutor began his speech with confidence, as if the outcome of the case was already decided. James noticed how the judge nodded disapprovingly, as if supporting the prosecution's stance. But James wasn't going to give up. He had prepared thoroughly. His evidence was indisputable, and he was ready to defend every word. When it was his turn to speak, James rose and began his address. He knew that every word had to be precise, every piece of evidence irrefutable. The prosecutor tried to interrupt him several times. The judge made remarks, but James remained steadfast. The room was filled with tense silence as James presented the evidence that he knew could change the course of the case. He spoke about bias, about the injustice that had taken root in the system, and about how his client had become a victim of this system. "My client is innocent, and this has been proven on all levels," James declared firmly, looking directly at the judge. "This court should be a place of justice, not prejudice." James's words caused a wave of murmurs in the room. The prosecutor and judge exchanged worried glances. James felt their confidence beginning to waver. He knew he had struck at the very heart of the issue, and now all that was left was to wait for the reaction. When the climactic moment of the session arrived, James played his final card, new evidence that had been gathered thanks to his persistence and determination. He saw the worry on the faces of the prosecutor and judge. This evidence couldn't be ignored, and it clearly cast doubt on the entire prosecution's case. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop as James finished his speech. The judge remained silent for a long time, weighing what had been said. The prosecutor tried to argue, but his words sounded unconvincing. James knew this moment could be a turning point in his case. Finally, after considering all the arguments, the judge delivered the verdict. Despite the bias and resistance, the truth had prevailed. James felt the tension in the room give way to relief. His client was acquitted, and this was a victory not only for him, but for the entire system, which, if only for a moment, showed that justice could triumph. When James left the courtroom, he felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. He knew that this victory was the result of his resilience and belief in the truth. He had proven that even in the most difficult situation, if you don't give up, you can achieve justice. This victory gave him strength and confidence that his fight had not been in vain. He knew that new challenges lay ahead, but now he was ready for them, knowing that truth and justice were on his side. James woke up in the middle of the night, feeling a heaviness in his chest. His heart was pounding as if trying to escape from his chest, and his breathing was labored and uneven. He sat up in bed, trying to calm down, but the anxiety wouldn't go away. His mind was filled with thoughts about the upcoming day, about the cases he had yet to finish, and about how his struggle for justice seemed to be consuming his entire life. His health had begun to fail him, and James knew it. The constant stress, sleepless nights, the pressure and threats, all of this was gradually destroying him from the inside. But every time he thought about taking a break, images of the people he had helped and those still waiting for his help would flash through his mind. he felt that he had no right to back down. "I can't give up now," he whispered to himself, sitting in the dark room, illuminated only by the dim light of a street lamp seeping through the window. The internal conflict was tearing him apart. On the one hand, he understood that his body could no longer endure such stress. On the other hand, his duty and convictions wouldn't allow him to stop. The next morning, James met with Elizabeth, who immediately noticed his pallor and exhaustion. "You don't look well, James," she said, gently touching his hand. "Maybe you should take some time off? Rest a little?" But James only shook his head, avoiding her gaze. "I have too much work, Elizabeth. I can't afford to step back now. Too much is riding on this case." Elizabeth sighed, knowing that it would be difficult to change his mind. She could see how his fight was gradually destroying him, and she feared that it would end badly one day. Despite his deteriorating health, James continued to work. Every day he immersed himself in documents, prepared arguments, met with clients and colleagues, but his body increasingly refused to cooperate. From time to time he felt dizzy, weak, and even experienced flashes of light before his eyes. But despite all this, he kept working, convincing himself that his mission was more important than anything else. One evening, while he was sitting in his office, he was visited by a doctor. This was an old family friend who had known James for a long time and knew just how stubborn he could be. "James, I can see that you're not doing well," the doctor began, sitting down across from him. "You can't go on like this. Your heart and nervous system won't withstand this kind of stress. You need rest, or the consequences could be irreversible." James sighed heavily, knowing that his friend was right, but he couldn't afford to back down. "I understand that you're worried, but I don't have time to rest. If I stop now, everything I've done will be for nothing." The doctor looked at him with concern. "But if you continue like this, you might not live to see the end of this case. You need to think about yourself, James." But James only shook his head. "I can't. I just can't." These words reflected his internal conflict. He knew that his health was at risk, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. For him, justice and the fight for truth were more important than anything, even his own life. On the day of the important court hearing, James felt that his strength was running out. He stood before the mirror, trying to gather his thoughts, but his mind was in chaos. His heart was racing, and his hands were trembling. But despite this, he pulled himself together and headed to the courthouse. When he began his speech, he immediately felt his body resisting. The words came slowly, as if through force, and dark spots began to appear in his vision. But James kept speaking, knowing that this was his last chance to convey the truth to the court and achieve justice for his client. And suddenly, everything began to darken. The sounds around him started to fade, and his body became uncontrollable. The last thing he remembered was his knees buckling, and he lost consciousness, collapsing right at the podium. The courtroom erupted in cries and panic. James was immediately given medical attention and taken to the hospital. The doctor said that he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and complete exhaustion. Waking up in a hospital bed, James realized just how close he had come to crossing a fatal line. His body had finally said, "Stop," despite his determination to keep going. Lying in the hospital bed, he thought about what might have happened if he hadn't collapsed. For the first time in a long while, he realized that life was not just about the fight, but also about health, and that even the most noble goal wasn't worth his own life. Elizabeth was by his side, holding his hand. She looked at him with worry and love, and James finally understood that he couldn't continue in the same way. "I understand now that I need to change my approach," he said quietly, looking at her. "I can't fight for the truth if I'm not here." Elizabeth nodded, feeling that he had finally heard her words. James decided to continue his fight, but now with a more balanced approach. He realized that to change the world, one must be strong, both physically and mentally, and that for the sake of justice, he shouldn't sacrifice his life. After spending several weeks in the hospital recovering, James finally returned to work. Physically, he felt better, but emotionally, he was drained. The illness had shown him his vulnerability and made him realize that he wasn't invincible. However, it also gave him a new understanding and determination to continue the fight, but now with a more thought-out strategy. When James walked into his office, his colleagues greeted him with warm smiles and words of support. However, he sensed that behind these smiles lay something more: concern, anxiety for his future. It seemed to him that his stay in the hospital had made him more vulnerable in the eyes of those around him. Elizabeth, who met him at the office door, came closer and gently touched his hand. "I'm glad you're back, James," she said, looking him straight in the eyes. "But please be careful. I know your fight is important, but you need to think about yourself too." James nodded, feeling the warmth of her words, but internally he already knew that he couldn't stop. His previous successes had drawn the attention not only of his allies, but also of powerful enemies. Now he knew that more than just his life was at stake, but also the lives of those who believed in him and his mission. His thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was Marcus, one of his longtime allies, who told James that they had found new evidence that could radically change the course of the case. Hearing this, James felt a flame reignite in his soul. He realized that his return shouldn't be in vain, and now he had a new goal: to see the case through to the end. James quickly immersed himself in work. Together with Marcus and other lawyers and human rights defenders, he began to develop a strategy aimed at exposing the corrupt judicial system. James felt that their team had become stronger, that now they had a real chance to achieve justice. At one of the meetings with his allies, James presented the new evidence they had gathered. These were documents and testimonies that confirmed that the charges against his client had been fabricated and that high-ranking figures were behind it, wanting to maintain the status quo. "These documents are our chance," Marcus said, examining the papers. "But we must act carefully. They will do anything to stop us." James nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. He knew that their enemies wouldn't stop at anything to protect their interests. But along with this, he felt that they had a real chance of victory. They decided to organize a protest to draw public attention to the case. James knew this was risky, but he also understood that without the support of the people, their fight would be much more difficult. Activists and human rights defenders supported his decision, and soon the plan was ready. Inside James, the tension was growing. He understood that he was putting himself in harm's way, but he couldn't back down. His desire to achieve justice was stronger than the fear of the consequences. The protest took place under the slogans of "fighting corruption" and "injustice." James gave a speech that inspired many. He spoke about how the judicial system should protect the rights of all, not serve the interests of the powerful. His words resonated in the hearts of the people, and he felt that their fight was gaining new meaning. But suddenly, the situation changed. The protest was brutally dispersed by the police, and James was arrested on false charges. He was accused of organizing an illegal gathering and inciting unrest. As they led him to the police station, James felt a mix of anger and despair. He knew he had become a target for those who wanted to maintain the status quo, but he also realized that this event could become a turning point. In the jail cell, left alone with his thoughts, James began to rethink his methods of fighting. He realized that his enemies were ready to do anything to stop him, and that he needed to change his strategy. The fight for truth was not just a legal battle, but also a social movement in which public support was crucial. The next day, when he was released on bail, James left the jail with a new understanding. He knew that his arrest was an attempt to intimidate and break him, but instead, he felt a surge of strength. Now he was ready to use all available methods to achieve justice. He decided to engage more actively with the public and human rights organizations, knowing that only combined efforts could bring about real change. James stepped out of the jail on bail, feeling like he was still in a nightmare that continued even after waking up. Once free, he faced a reality that was no less harsh than his time in detention. In the few days he had spent behind bars, his reputation had been destroyed. In the newspapers and on television, his name was mentioned in the context of scandal and crimes he had not committed. People he had considered allies turned away from him, fearing for their own reputations. When James walked into his office, he felt that the atmosphere had changed. Colleagues avoided him, and some openly showed their disdain. It was a low blow, but James knew that his enemies would do everything they could to break him. Elizabeth, his steadfast support, was by his side, but even she couldn't hide her anxiety. "James, maybe you should consider stepping back from the case for a while. Your reputation, all of this could destroy you," she said, looking into his eyes. James felt anger, disappointment, but most of all, determination. "I can't back down, Elizabeth. If I give up now, they win. I have to prove my innocence, and I'll do it, no matter the obstacles." These words became his internal motto. He understood that now the fight for truth had become not only his case, but his life. Days passed, and each day brought new blows. The media continued to smear his name, portraying him as a criminal and a lawbreaker. James's reputation was rapidly declining. An order was issued to temporarily suspend his law license. This was the final straw. They had deprived him of the ability to do what he did best, thereby undermining his source of income. His financial situation worsened, debts piled up, and the future looked bleak. James was close to losing everything he had worked for his entire life. But in these difficult moments, he unexpectedly found support among people who had also suffered from the system. Other lawyers, human rights defenders, and ordinary citizens began to reach out to him, offering help and support. Marcus, one of those who had stood by his side from the very beginning, visited James in his office. "You're not alone, James," Marcus said, squeezing his hand. "We all understand what you're going through. You're fighting not only for yourself, but for all of us. We won't let them destroy you." These words gave James new strength. He realized that his fight for justice had resonated in the hearts of many people. Despite losing his license and facing financial difficulties, he was ready to continue the fight, because he felt that his mission was important, not only for himself, but for all those who suffered from injustice. During one of the court hearings where his client's case was being considered, James did something he had long hesitated to do. He stood up and gave a speech that stunned everyone present. His voice was filled with passion and determination. He spoke about the racism that had permeated the entire judicial system, about the injustice he had witnessed with his own eyes, and about how they had tried to break him and silence him. "This system is corrupt to the core," he declared, looking directly at the judge and prosecutor. "But I'm here to fight not just for my client, but for everyone who has suffered from this injustice. I won't let you continue to violate people's rights. I won't give up, and I won't be silenced." James's words sparked a wave of emotions in the courtroom. Many of those present stood up and began to applaud. His speech became a catalyst that triggered a wave of support from the public and drew attention to his fight. But it also attracted the attention of powerful people who had much to lose from his struggle. After the hearing, James felt that his fight was beginning to bear fruit. He understood that his voice was starting to change public opinion, and that his personal sacrifices had not been in vain. Despite all the risks, he decided to go all the way. Now he knew that justice was achievable if you fought for it with all your heart. James sat in his office, staring out the window, where the gray cityscape concealed his thoughts from prying eyes. The events of recent weeks had drained his strength, and he could feel the weight of the struggle pressing down on his shoulders harder than ever before. He knew his opponents wouldn't stop until they destroyed him, but knowing this didn't make the task any easier. At that moment, the ringing of the phone interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. James, we have an offer that you should consider," said an unfamiliar voice on the other end. The voice was cold, calculating, but there was a confidence in it that belonged to someone accustomed to resolving matters quickly and without unnecessary words. James tensed, sensing that there was more behind these words. "What kind of offer are we talking about?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. "You've made significant progress, and we acknowledge that, but you've also put yourself in an extremely dangerous position. We can ensure your safety and even offer you new opportunities if you stop your fight and abandon the case." These words hit him like a blow. James froze, feeling a fire of indignation ignite within him, while at the same time, a growing sense of anxiety took hold. He understood that this conversation was an attempt to bribe him, to make him abandon his principles. But what if the offer truly provided a way out of this deadly game, allowing him to save his life and the lives of those he cared about? When James hung up the phone, he was full of conflicting emotions. Outwardly, he remained calm, but inside, a storm was raging. This offer placed him before a moral choice that would determine the course of his life. The next day, James couldn't shake the thoughts of the offer he had received. Every time he tried to focus on work, his mind returned to that conversation. He couldn't help but think about what this offer might mean for him and his loved ones. Perhaps it was a chance to start a new life, free from constant fear and threats. But each time James began to consider accepting the offer, the faces of those for whom he fought appeared in his mind. He remembered his early cases, standing in court defending those whom the system sought to destroy. He recalled the promise he made to himself never to betray his ideals and always stand on the side of justice. Elizabeth, seeing his turmoil, approached him in the evening when they were alone. "James, I can see you're troubled. You must make the decision that's right for you. But remember, your life and safety are important to me and to everyone who loves you," she said, squeezing his hand. "I can't just abandon everything I've fought for," James replied, his voice filled with pain. "But I also can't ignore the fact that this offer might save my life. I'm confused, Elizabeth." Her words were a comfort to him, but not a solution. The internal conflict reached its peak. James understood that accepting the offer meant betraying all his ideals, but refusal could lead to dire consequences for him and his loved ones. The day arrived when James had to give his answer. He knew this decision would change his life forever. He spent the entire day in contemplation, trying to weigh the pros and cons. At some point, he decided to go outside to clear his head and find an answer to the tormenting question. As he walked down the street, he noticed a small group of people gathered near the courthouse. These were the people he fought for, ordinary citizens whose lives he tried to protect from injustice. In their eyes, he saw the hope he had instilled in them with his actions and words. James felt a new wave of determination rising within him. Returning to his office, he sat at his desk and picked up the phone. Dialing the number, he waited for someone to answer on the other end. "Mr. James, have you made a decision?" asked the same cold voice. "Yes," James replied, his voice firm and confident. "I will not accept your offer. I cannot betray my ideals and the people I fight for." These words felt like a liberating confession. James felt the weight that had been pressing on his shoulders begin to lift. He knew that this decision put his life in danger, but he also knew that his struggle was more important than personal safety. The next day, James publicly announced his refusal to accept the offer. This sparked a new wave of support from the public. People saw in him a leader willing to go to the end for justice, despite all threats and dangers. James sat in his office, staring at the pile of documents spread out before him. Each page, every line, contained a piece of the story that could potentially save his client's life. But he knew that truth alone would not suffice. He was about to face a system that would do everything in its power to crush his last chances. His enemies were more powerful and ruthless than he could have imagined. Outside the window, the sun was slowly setting, enveloping the room in a soft orange glow. But instead of bringing peace, this light only heightened his internal tension. James knew that the moment of truth was approaching, the final battle in which he could either win or suffer a devastating defeat. He understood that this trial would not just be another case, but the culmination of his entire struggle for justice. Elizabeth entered the office, noticing his tired expression. "You're working too hard, James," she said quietly, approaching him. "You need to rest before tomorrow. It's important not just for you, but for all of us." James nodded, but his mind was spinning with thoughts that he didn't have the right to rest. "I can't stop, Elizabeth. Tomorrow will decide everything. I need to be 100% ready." She sighed, realizing she wouldn't be able to persuade him. "Just remember, you've already done everything possible, and no matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Her words slightly eased his inner tension. He smiled at her, feeling the warmth of her support penetrate his heart. Yet he still understood that tomorrow he would have to face powerful forces that would stop at nothing to destroy him. The next day, James entered the courtroom, feeling all eyes on him. His presence, his confidence, everything was the result of months of intense work. But he knew that his opponents were equally prepared. Every move was calculated, every detail thought out. When the session began, the prosecutor immediately went on the offensive, trying to discredit James and his evidence. The judge seemed biased as well. But James was ready for this. He gathered all his strength to speak decisively and confidently, despite the inner tension. When it was his turn to speak, James stood up and presented new evidence to the court. These were documents he had been searching for a long time, witnesses found at the last moment. Every fact, every word was aimed at dismantling the wall of lies and injustice built against his client. "These pieces of evidence are indisputable," he said, looking directly at the judge and the prosecutor. "Today, we must decide whose side we are on, the side of truth or the side of those who try to hide it." A tense silence filled the courtroom. Even James's staunchest opponents couldn't deny the strength of the presented facts. The judge, who had previously seemed biased, now appeared confused. The prosecutor tried to counter, but his arguments sounded weak and unconvincing. James felt his heart beating in time with every word, but he kept pushing forward, knowing this was his last chance. He knew that if he lost, it would be a defeat, not just for him, but for all those who believed in his fight. After a long and tense session, the judge finally announced his decision. James stood waiting, his hands trembling slightly from the tension. When the judge began to speak, the room fell silent. Based on the presented evidence and witness testimonies, the court concludes that the charges against Mr. James's client were fabricated. The court finds him not guilty. These words struck like thunder in a clear sky. Applause broke out in the courtroom, and James felt relief wash over him. His client was free, and this was his victory, a victory that had been hard won, but one that justified all his efforts and sacrifices. Elizabeth, standing in the courtroom, cried tears of joy. She had seen what James had gone through, and knew that this victory was the result of his perseverance and determination. James looked at her, feeling his heart swell with pride and gratitude, but he also understood that this was not just his personal victory. It was a victory for all those who believed in justice, who didn't give up despite all the hardships. James knew that his fight had not been in vain, and that justice, though hard won, could prevail if one fought for it to the very end. After the intense struggle, James finally savored the taste of victory. The courtroom, where his client's fate had recently been decided, now seemed to him a place where he had achieved both personal and professional triumph. But despite this joy, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of his journey. He was overwhelmed with emotions, pride for himself and his team, gratitude toward those who supported him in this difficult case, and a deep understanding that his victory was only the first step in a much larger battle. James returned to his office, which now felt different to him. In the eyes of the people he encountered, he saw respect and even admiration. For the first time in a long while, he felt the support of the community. Newspapers wrote about his victory, and human rights organizations began approaching him with offers of collaboration, making James contemplate what his next move should be. Elizabeth, as always, was by his side. She saw the new resolve in his eyes, but she also noticed a shadow of worry hidden behind that resolve. "You won, James. People have finally seen that justice can prevail," she said, smiling at him. "This is only the beginning, Elizabeth," he replied, lowering his eyes. "The system I managed to shake is still standing. This isn't the end, it's the beginning, and now I have to decide what to do next." These words had never been spoken aloud before, but they had long been brewing in his mind. The victory he had achieved was important, but James knew there was still much work ahead, and he had to be ready for new challenges. The next day, James began receiving offers of collaboration from various human rights organizations. They invited him to join the ranks of those fighting for human rights, to use his experience and knowledge to support those who continue to struggle against injustice. These offers were tempting, and he knew he could do a lot of good by working with these organizations. But along with this came a realization. James understood that real change required more than just participation in organizations. The system he had managed to shake was far from being dismantled. He felt that he needed to do something bigger, something that could not just influence the situation, but change it fundamentally. During one of his conversations with Marcus, an old friend and ally, they discussed possible ways to continue the fight. "You've done a lot, James," Marcus said. "Your victory has inspired people, showing them that it's possible to fight and win. But what are you planning to do next?" James pondered. He knew that his journey was just beginning, and that he needed to find a way to use his victory to create lasting change. "I think it's time to create something of my own," he finally said, looking at Marcus. "I want to establish a law practice that will fight for the rights of the oppressed. I want every person facing injustice to know that there is a place where they can turn for help." Marcus smiled. "That sounds like a plan, James. This won't just be a job, it'll be a mission." James nodded, feeling a new wave of determination rising within him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also understood that this was his path, the path he had to take. The decision was made. James began working on establishing his law practice, which was to become a bastion of the fight for justice and the protection of the oppressed. He was clear that in order to change the world, he had to start small, with one case, one person, one truth. But he believed that his example and his work could inspire others to join the fight. Support came quickly. People who believed in his mission began offering their help, both moral and financial. Soon, other lawyers joined him, ready to work for the greater good, even if it meant standing against powerful forces. At the opening ceremony of the new practice, James gave a speech emphasizing the importance of the fight for justice. "We cannot turn a blind eye to the injustice that occurs around us," he said, addressing the gathering. "We must fight for the rights of every person who has been wrongfully accused, who has found themselves downtrodden by a system that is supposed to protect us all. This is our mission, and we will not back down." His words were met with applause, and James felt that his struggle, his sacrifices, had not been in vain. He knew that there was still much work ahead, but now he had a team, support, and a goal that filled his life with new meaning.